March 17, 1944, 3:47 a.m. Portsmouth Naval Dockyard, England. Dr. Edmund Hartley pressed his cold fingers against the hull of U-534, feeling the metal surface in complete darkness. The captured German submarine sat in Dry Dock 7, stripped and silent. Hartley ran his hand along a welding seam near the pressure hull and felt it, a crack, hairline thin, running 18 inches vertically, in the exact location that should have been the strongest point of the entire vessel. "Impossible," he whispered. "Before we continue with Dr. Hartley's incredible discovery, we need your help to keep these forgotten heroes alive. If you're already hooked by what you're hearing, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this with more people who care about real history. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of courage and innovation from World War II. And here's something we love. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your country, your city. We have viewers from Buenos Aires to Berlin, from Manila to Montreal. Are you a veteran? Did your grandfather serve? Do you have a connection to this war? We want to hear from you. Now back to Portsmouth, March 1944, where Dr. Hartley was about to uncover the secret that would explain Germany's defeat. Hartley had found cracks in 17 different welds across the submarine's hull, on a vessel less than 8 months old. This wasn't battle damage, this wasn't fatigue, this was catastrophic structural failure built directly into the construction. By sunrise, he'd called in 6 more metallurgists. Edmund Hartley was 43 years old, born in Sheffield, the steel capital of England. His father had worked the blast furnaces for 30 years, and Edmund had grown up understanding metal the way other boys understood cricket. He'd earned his doctorate from Cambridge in 1926, studying material science and metallurgy. Short, barely 5'6", with thick glasses that fogged in the damp dockyard air, Hartley looked more like a clerk than the man who would unlock one of the war's greatest secrets. He'd volunteered for the Admiralty's Technical Analysis Division in 1940, right after Dunkirk. While other scientists worked on radar and explosives, Hartley requested something different. He wanted to examine captured enemy equipment. Specifically, he wanted to understand why things failed. "Most people study why weapons work," he'd told the recruitment officer. "I want to know why they don't." For 4 years, Hartley had examined everything the Royal Navy captured: torpedoes, shell casings, armor plating, engine components. He built a reputation as the man who could read metal like text, understanding its history through microscopic analysis. But until U-534 arrived in Portsmouth, he'd never seen anything like this. The problem had been growing for 18 months, though nobody recognized the pattern. Between September 1942 and March 1944, Allied naval forces had sunk 219 German U-boats. Standard number, the Battle of the Atlantic was brutal and losses were expected. But buried in those statistics was something nobody had noticed. 47 submarines had simply vanished. No distress calls, no wreckage, no survivors. Just gone. U-47 disappeared in March 1941, U-85 in April 1942, U-512 in October 1942, 12 more in 1943, all experienced crews, all relatively new boats, all lost in circumstances that made no tactical sense. Calm seas, no enemy contact reported, good weather. The official explanation was enemy action, depth charges that left no survivors, aircraft attacks at night, mines. But Hartley had read every after-action report, and something felt wrong. The distribution was too random, too many losses in areas with minimal Allied presence. Then came February 12, 1944, Lieutenant James Morrison, Royal Navy, age 26, from Liverpool. He'd grown up on the docks, watching ships come and go, dreaming of the sea. He'd joined the Navy at 18, worked his way up through pure competence. Morrison and Hartley had become friends during the analysis of captured German torpedoes. Morrison supplied the tactical knowledge. Hartley provided the technical understanding. Morrison commanded HMS Sunfish, a submarine on patrol near Norway. His mission: observe German U-boat traffic, gather intelligence, stay hidden. On February 12th, Sunfish tracked U-264 through the deep waters off Bergen. Morrison watched through the periscope as U-264 executed a routine dive to 400 feet. And then U-264 simply imploded. No depth charges, no combat. Morrison saw it through the periscope. The German submarine reached 400 feet. And the pressure hull catastrophically failed. The boat folded inward like a crushed tin can. Total structural collapse in less than 3 seconds. 72 men died instantly. Morrison surfaced, retrieved floating debris, and brought it back to Portsmouth. He handed it personally to Hartley. "Edmund, something's wrong with their boats. This wasn't us. This was them." 6 days later, Morrison's submarine struck a mine off the Dutch coast. There were no survivors. Hartley received the news while examining the debris from U-264. He'd made Morrison a promise the last time they'd met, that he'd figure out what was killing German submariners, that he'd understand the pattern. Morrison wanted to know if the Allies had developed some new weapon he didn't know about, something that could crush submarines without warning. Now Morrison was gone, and Hartley sat alone in his laboratory at midnight, staring at twisted pieces of German steel. That's when he noticed it. The weld seams on the debris showed something unusual. Microscopic crystalline structures that shouldn't exist in properly made submarine-grade steel. Hartley spent 3 days examining samples under increasingly powerful microscopes. What he found didn't make sense. The German steel contained sulfur levels 4 times higher than standard. The manganese content was inconsistent. Worse, the welds showed traces of phosphorus which made steel brittle. This wasn't specification-grade material. This was scrap metal, barely refined, welded together with substandard techniques. But U-boats were Germany's most critical weapon. Why would they use inferior materials? Then U-534 arrived, captured intact off the coast of Denmark, forced to surface after depth charge damage that didn't sink her. The Royal Navy towed her to Portsmouth, and Hartley got his chance to examine a complete recent U-boat from the inside. What he found would change everything. Hartley worked alone that first night, March 16th into 17th. The dockyard was empty, just him and the submarine. He started with the pressure hull, the critical shell that kept 200 tons of ocean pressure from crushing the crew inside. Standard procedure was to check welds under pressure testing, but Hartley started simpler. He used a handheld magnifying glass and a flashlight, walking the entire interior hull, checking every seam by eye. 17 cracks, visible to the naked eye. On a submarine commissioned in July 1943, just 8 months old. By dawn, Hartley had called in his entire team. Dr. Margaret Finch from Cambridge, expert in tensile strength. Professor Alan Wright from Imperial College, specialist in metal fatigue. 4 more metallurgists from the Ministry of Supply. They descended on U-534 like forensic investigators at a crime scene. Hartley directed them to take samples from every critical weld point. Hull seams, bulkhead connections, torpedo tube mounts, conning tower base. They worked for 40 straight hours, cutting samples, labeling, cataloging. The submarine was systematically dissected. The laboratory analysis took another week. What they found was staggering. The steel used in U-534's construction was grade C2 naval steel, standard submarine specification, but the actual composition was catastrophically compromised. The carbon content was irregular, varying by location. The nickel levels, critical for underwater pressure resistance, were 60% below specification. Molybdenum, which prevents brittleness, was almost entirely absent. But the welds were worse. Proper submarine welding requires specific temperatures, cooling rates, and filler materials. The German welds showed none of this. The filler metal was inconsistent, probably recycled from multiple sources. The heat-affected zones around welds showed massive grain growth, meaning the welding had been done too hot, too fast, without proper cooling. The metallurgical bond between base metal and weld was weak. Under microscopic examination, the weld zones showed voids, tiny pockets of air or gas trapped in the metal. Each void was a stress concentrator, a place where cracks would start under pressure. Some welds had void densities of 15–20%. They were essentially metal foam, not solid steel. Finch ran tensile tests on samples. Standard submarine hull welds should withstand 80 pounds per square inch before failure. The German welds failed at 34 psi, less than half the required strength. Wright tested fatigue resistance, how many pressure cycles the metal could endure. Properly made submarine steel should survive 50 0 dive cycles to 600 feet. The German samples failed after 300 cycles to just 400 feet. "They're building submarines that can't dive," Finch said quietly. Hartley sat in the laboratory, surrounded by test results, and felt cold understanding wash over him. This wasn't one bad submarine. This was systemic. If U-534 had these flaws, every U-boat built in the same period probably did too. He pulled out a map of German U-boat losses. He marked every mysterious disappearance, boats lost without combat. He overlaid construction dates and shipyard data. The pattern was undeniable. Submarines built before 1942 had normal loss rates, about 8% to unknown causes. Submarines built in 1942 showed 11% losses to unknown causes. Submarines built in 1943 showed 22% losses. Boats from late 1943 showed 31% loss to unknown causes. They weren't being sunk by the Allies. They were sinking themselves. Hartley wrote his preliminary report on March 28, 1944. 8 pages, single-spaced, with 47 pages of supporting data. He titled it, "Catastrophic Material Failure in German Submarine Construction, Evidence of Complete Industrial Collapse." The report went to the Admiralty, then to the War Cabinet, then to Churchill himself. The conclusion was simple and devastating. Germany was losing the material war so completely that they could no longer build functioning submarines. The Allied blockade had strangled their supply of critical elements: nickel from Canada, molybdenum from the United States, chromium from Turkey, tungsten from China. Without these elements, German steel was fundamentally weak. Desperate to maintain U-boat production numbers, because Hitler demanded it, German shipyards were using whatever steel they could get. Recycled metal from demolished buildings, low-grade ore from exhausted mines, steel that would barely qualify for peacetime cargo ships, being used to build submarines that had to withstand crushing deep-ocean pressure. The welding problems stemmed from the same desperation. Skilled welders had been drafted to the Eastern Front. Replacements were undertrained teenagers and forced labor from occupied territories. They worked faster to meet production quotas, with inferior equipment, using whatever welding wire was available. Quality control had essentially ceased to exist. The result was submarines that looked functional, but were structurally doomed. They could complete sea trials in shallow water, but when operational submarines dove deep during combat, when they needed their hulls to be strong, the welds failed. The voids grew into cracks. The cracks propagated, and the pressure hull catastrophically collapsed. Hartley calculated that at least 40 German U-boats had been lost this way, probably more. The number would never be precisely known because the boats vanished completely, crushed at depth, leaving no evidence. But the implications went beyond submarines. If German submarine construction had degraded this badly, what about their tanks, their aircraft, their artillery? The report suggested that material shortages were compromising every aspect of German military production. "The Wehrmacht," Hartley wrote, "is equipped with weapons that appear functional but are internally compromised. The Allies are not fighting Germany's army of 1939. We are fighting an army equipped with increasingly defective weapons, made from increasingly inadequate materials." The report made Hartley briefly famous within the British military establishment. He was invited to brief generals and admirals. American metallurgists flew to Portsmouth to see the evidence. The revelation changed strategic thinking. If German equipment was failing internally, the Allies needed to maintain the blockade absolutely. Choking Germany's material supply was as effective as destroying their armies in the field. But Hartley took no satisfaction from it. He kept thinking about the German submariners, men like him, doing their duty, trusting their equipment, going to sea in boats that their own government had sent them out in, knowing or not caring that the submarines were fundamentally unsafe. 72 men on U-264, 58 men on U-515, 44 men on U-603, all dead, not from Allied action, but from their own leadership's desperation. In May 1944, Hartley received a different assignment. The Admiralty wanted him to expand the investigation, examine captured German tanks, aircraft components, anything they could get. The work was important, but it felt like examining corpses to understand a plague. By June, the pattern was everywhere. German panzer armor showed similar quality degradation. Aircraft engine components were failing prematurely. Rifle barrels were wearing out after a few hundred rounds. The entire German war machine was literally falling apart. The material war was over. Germany had lost it in 1943, though they kept fighting into 1945. Hartley testified at several post-war investigations about German industrial capacity. His report became classified evidence at Nuremberg, proof that German leadership had continued the war long after it was materially unwinnable, sending men into battle with defective equipment. He never received public recognition. The work was classified, and Britain's Official Secrets Act kept him silent for decades. In 1946, he returned to his teaching position at Sheffield Technical College. Students knew him as a quiet professor who taught material science. None of them knew he'd helped explain why Germany lost the war. Hartley married in 1947, Susan Walsh, a librarian from York. They had 2 daughters. He lived in a modest house in Sheffield, the same neighborhood where he'd grown up. He rode the bus to work. He tended a small garden. He rarely spoke about the war. In 1962, a German historian contacted him, researching U-boat losses. Hartley agreed to an interview, but most of the conversation remained classified. The historian published a paper noting metallurgical failures, but couldn't include details. It wasn't until 1978, when British wartime documents began declassification, that Hartley's full report became public. By then, he was 77 years old, retired, mostly forgotten. A few military historians recognized the significance. Hartley's analysis had revealed something profound, that wars are won not just with tactics and courage, but with industrial capacity and material science. Germany lost the war in their factories and mines before they lost it on battlefields. Edmund Hartley died on November 3, 1982, at age 81, in Sheffield Royal Hospital. The obituary in the Sheffield Star mentioned his long career as a professor and his service during the war, but didn't elaborate. Most readers would have assumed he'd done standard military research. His papers, donated to the Imperial War Museum in 1995 by his daughters, filled 3 boxes. The centerpiece was his original 1944 report on U-534, with its careful diagrams of failed welds, its microscopic photographs of compromised metal, its devastating conclusion, written in precise academic language. There's a small display case in the Imperial War Museum's research library that contains a section of hull from U-534, a piece of welded steel about 8 inches square. The weld seam runs diagonally across it. Under magnification, you can see the hairline crack, barely visible. That would have grown into catastrophic failure. A small placard reads, "This weld failure explained the mystery of 47 lost U-boats, 1942-1944, analyzed by Dr. Edmund Hartley, Portsmouth Naval Dockyard." Few visitors ever see it. It's not dramatic enough for the main exhibition floors. It doesn't look like much, just a piece of old cracked metal, but Hartley would have appreciated that. He'd spent his career understanding that the most important things in war aren't always the most visible. That failure isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's microscopic, built into the structure, waiting for the right pressure to reveal itself. The Battle of the Atlantic is remembered for depth charges and torpedoes, for convoy battles and ace commanders. But it was also won by a middle-aged professor from Sheffield who looked at welds nobody else noticed and understood what they revealed about a collapsing empire. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe to keep these forgotten chapters of history alive. Drop a comment and tell us, did you know about the material shortages that crippled German weapons? Do you have a connection to submarine warfare or metallurgy? We want to hear from you. And remember, sometimes the most important battles aren't fought with guns. Sometimes they're fought in factories, in mines, in laboratories, by people whose names never made the history books but who changed the course of the war. Thank you for keeping these memories alive. The secret German response. What Hartley didn't know in March 1944, what he wouldn't discover until classified German documents surfaced in 1947, was that the Kriegsmarine already knew about the problem. They'd known since October 1942. Kapitän zur See Heinrich Lehmann-Willenbrock, age 34, commander of the 9th U-boat flotilla in Brest, France, had been filing reports for 8 months. Reports that were systematically ignored, buried, or classified above his clearance level. Reports that detailed the exact same structural failures Hartley would later discover. Lehmann-Willenbrock was a survivor. He'd commanded U-96 through 21 patrols, sunk 25 Allied ships, and brought his crew home every time. He knew submarines the way a pianist knows their instrument, intimately, instinctively. And in the fall of 1942, he started noticing that the new boats arriving at Brest felt wrong. The first incident was U-boats reporting minor leaks after shallow dives. Nothing catastrophic, but unusual. Then U-442 returned from patrol with stress fractures around the conning tower base. U-566 reported excessive hull creaking at 200 meters, a depth that should have been routine. U-653's commander described metal sounds during deep dives that he'd never heard before. Lehmann-Willenbrock ordered inspections. What his mechanics found matched exactly what Hartley would later discover: deteriorating welds, substandard steel, microscopic cracks in critical hull sections. On October 14, 1942, Lehmann-Willenbrock sent a classified report directly to Gross Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet. The report was 12 pages long, technically detailed, and contained a sentence that should have stopped U-boat production immediately. The structural integrity of submarines constructed after May 1942 is fundamentally compromised. These vessels cannot be considered operationally safe for deep-water combat operations. Dönitz's response arrived 6 days later. 2 sentences stamped Geheim. Secret. Your concerns are noted. Production schedules will not be altered. Operational deployments will continue as planned. Lehmann-Willenbrock read it 3 times, unable to believe what he was seeing. He called a meeting with his flotilla commanders, 8 veteran U-boat captains, men with a combined 140 combat patrols between them. They're ordering us to send crews to sea in defective boats, he told them, boats that might implode on their own. Korvettenkapitän Werner Henke, commander of U-515, was the first to speak. How defective? Engineering estimates suggest 25–30% increased risk of catastrophic hull failure during combat depth operations. The room went silent. That's not acceptable, said Henke finally. We need to refuse the boats. Demand proper construction. Lehmann-Willenbrock shook his head. I tried. Dönitz won't listen. Berlin won't listen. They care more about production numbers than crew safety. What none of them knew was that the problem went far beyond Dönitz. The Kriegsmarine senior leadership understood the material crisis perfectly. They simply had no solution and no intention of admitting it to Hitler. In Berlin, Vice Admiral Werner Fuchs ran the U-boat construction office. His classified memos from late 1942, discovered in Soviet archives in 1991, reveal the full scope of the disaster. Fuchs knew the steel was substandard. He knew the welds were failing. He knew submarines were being lost to structural failure. But stopping production was impossible. Hitler had personally ordered 40 U-boats per month. The entire strategic concept of the Atlantic battle depended on submarine numbers overwhelming Allied convoys. Admitting that German industry couldn't produce functional submarines would have been admitting defeat. So Fuchs did what desperate bureaucrats do. He covered it up. He ordered shipyards to implement enhanced inspection procedures that were purely theatrical. Welds were visually checked but not pressure tested. Hulls were approved based on paperwork, not metallurgical analysis. Any submarine that passed basic sea trials was declared operational, regardless of long-term structural integrity. Most damningly, Fuchs issued a secret directive in November 1942. Reports of structural deficiencies in operational submarines will be classified Geheime Kommandosache, top secret command matter, and will not be distributed beyond construction office personnel. Commanders like Lehmann-Willenbrock were sending detailed failure reports. Those reports went into classified files that almost nobody could access. The paper trail of the disaster was being systematically hidden. Meanwhile, crews kept dying. U-254 departed Kiel on December 2, 1942. Routine patrol to the North Atlantic. Experienced commander, good crew. On December 8th, U-254 radioed that they were diving to evade aircraft. That was the last transmission. The submarine was never heard from again. No wreckage was ever found. Official cause, enemy action. Actual cause, based on construction records discovered after the war. U-254 was built at Germaniawerft in October 1942 during the height of the steel shortage. Metallurgical analysis of sister ships suggests hull integrity was compromised. The boat probably imploded at depth. 47 men died. Their families were told they died fighting the enemy. They died because their government sent them to sea in a submarine that couldn't safely dive. This happened again and again throughout 1943. U-641 vanished in January, U-463 in May, U-523 in August. Each time the official records blamed enemy action. Each time the construction records told a different story. Substandard materials, inadequate welding, structural compromises that made the boats vulnerable to their own operational requirements. And each time, the reports from flotilla commanders were classified and buried. Lehmann Willenbrock kept filing reports. He documented every structural failure, every unusual leak, every boat that returned from patrol with suspicious damage. His files grew thicker. The official response remained the same. Production schedules would not be altered. In March 1943, Lehmann Willenbrock did something that should have gotten him court-martialed. He began quietly advising his commanders to limit their diving depths during patrols. Instead of the operational maximum of 200-250 meters, he suggested staying above 150 meters whenever possible. If you encounter depth charges, he told them privately, surface and fight it out with deck guns rather than diving deep. The pressure might kill you faster than the explosives. It was advice that contradicted every tactical doctrine. Submarines survived by diving, by using depth as protection. But Lehmann Willenbrock understood something the theorists in Berlin didn't. Tactics meant nothing if your hull collapsed. Some commanders followed his advice, some didn't. The ones who did had noticeably better survival rates, though nobody could officially acknowledge why. Werner Henke, commanding U-515, followed Lehmann Willenbrock's advice religiously. He never dove below 140 meters during his entire command. He brought his crew through 8 patrols, sank 26 Allied ships, and survived until April 1944, when his submarine was finally sunk in combat, by depth charges, not structural failure. Before he was captured, Henke destroyed his personal logs, but after the war, his executive officer testified that Henke had kept detailed notes about the hull problems. He said the boats were murder machines, the officer recalled, not for the enemy, for us. By mid-1943, the rumor network among U-boat crews had spread the truth. Submariners called the newer boats Sarglocken, coffin bells. They knew the steel was bad. They knew the welds failed. They went to sea anyway because refusing orders meant execution. The Kriegsmarine never formally acknowledged the problem, never halted production, never improved the materials, because they couldn't. The Allied blockade had choked off access to proper steel alloys. The choice was simple: build submarines with bad steel or stop building submarines entirely. They chose to keep building and keep sending men to sea in boats that might kill them. Vice Admiral Fuchs's final memo, dated March 15, 1945, 6 weeks before Germany surrendered, was discovered in 1952. It's a remarkable document, 3 pages of bureaucratic German acknowledging complete systemic failure. Submarine construction quality has deteriorated beyond acceptable standards. Material shortages have rendered proper metallurgical specifications impossible to achieve. Current production vessels should be considered suitable only for coastal operations at minimal depth. Deep-water Atlantic operations present unacceptable structural risk. However, given strategic requirements and Führer directives, production continues. The memo ends with a sentence that captures the entire moral failure. Operational commanders have not been informed of these limitations. In other words, we know the boats are defective, we're sending crews out anyway, and we're not telling them the truth. Lehmann Willenbrock survived the war. He was captured in May 1945 and spent 3 years in British POW camps. During interrogation, He provided extensive testimony about the structural failures. His reports corroborated everything Hartley had discovered. The timeline matched, the technical details aligned, the pattern of losses fit perfectly. British intelligence officers asked why he hadn't refused to deploy defective submarines. "I tried," Lehman Willenbrock said quietly. "I filed reports for 2 years. I documented everything. I was told to shut up and follow orders. What was I supposed to do? Mutiny? They would have shot me and sent the crews out anyway." After his release in 1948, Lehman Willenbrock returned to Hamburg and became a shipping consultant. He never spoke publicly about the submarine construction scandal. When historians contacted him in the 1960s, he declined interviews. Only once, in 1971, he broke his silence. A documentary filmmaker asked him about U-boat losses. Lehman Willenbrock, then 61 years old, sat in his small office overlooking Hamburg Harbor and said, "People think we lost the war because the Allies had better weapons, better tactics, better intelligence. That's not wrong. But we also lost because our own leadership sent us into battle with equipment they knew was defective. How do you fight a war when your own government is killing your men through negligence? You can't. We were doomed not just by the enemy, but by ourselves." The interview was never broadcast. The filmmaker said it was too controversial. Edmund Hartley met Lehman Willenbrock once, in 1958, at a naval history conference in London. They spoke for 2 hours. Hartley showed Lehman Willenbrock the metallurgical analysis from U-534. Lehman Willenbrock showed Hartley copies of his classified reports from 1942-1943. "I knew," Lehman Willenbrock said. "I told them they didn't care." "I know," Hartley replied. "I proved it. They still denied it." Two men on opposite sides of the war, united by the same terrible knowledge that the U-boat fleet had been destroyed as much by Germany's material collapse as by Allied action, that hundreds of submariners had died not in combat, but because their own industrial base had failed them and their leadership had lied about it. The conversation ended with Lehman Willenbrock asking a question that Hartley never forgot. "Do you think it made a difference? Your report, my reports, all the documentation. Did it change anything?" Hartley thought for a long time before answering. "It proved the truth. That has to matter. Someday." Lehman Willenbrock nodded slowly. Someday. But not for the men who drowned in those boats. Heinrich Lehman Willenbrock died in 1986 in Hamburg, age 76. Werner Henke had died in 1944, shot while attempting to escape POW custody. Vice Admiral Werner Fuchs died in 1968, never having publicly acknowledged his role in the construction scandal. The classified German documents detailing the known structural failures weren't fully declassified until 2001. By then, almost everyone involved was dead. There's a memorial in Miltenort, Germany, honoring the 28 German submariners who died during World War II. It's a quiet place, overlooking the water with bronze plaques listing names. Tourists visit occasionally. Few know that roughly 1/500 of those names, men who died in mysterious submarine losses, were probably killed not by the enemy, but by their own government's decision to deploy defective boats. Hartley's report explained how the submarines failed. The German documents explained why they were deployed anyway. Together, they tell the complete story of an industrial collapse that German leadership chose to hide at the cost of thousands of lives. If you're still watching, you've just learned something that most history books don't teach, that sometimes the greatest crime in war isn't losing. It's lying to your own soldiers about the tools you're sending them to fight with. Hit that like button if this story changed how you think about World War II. Subscribe to hear more forgotten truths from the war. And comment below. Did you know about Germany's material shortages? Did your family have connections to submarine service? These stories matter because they remind us that wars are fought by human beings who trusted their leaders. When that trust is betrayed, the consequences echo for generations.